You are listening to End of Life University Podcast, real talk about life and death. This is episode number 128. Welcome to End of Life University Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, hospice physician, author, and educator. In this podcast, I share thoughtful conversations with experts in various fields related to dying and death, and informative teaching sessions on preparing for the end of life by living fully today. And I want to thank you so much for joining me here today for another episode. In a little while, I'm going to be sharing why I believe death education is important right now for everyone. And as we get into that, I'll explain why I am passionate about that and why death education for everyone is my goal, my initiative for 2018 to help support death education and really promote the idea that we need to be teaching far more classes about death ed. And so there will be several episodes upcoming in the future that will go into the subject even more and expand on some of these areas. So stay tuned. I'll be talking about that in just a moment. As far as announcements, I'll just mention again the online reading group, A Year of Reading Dangerously, which is also taking place for 2018, and it's part of this movement toward death education that I'm trying to promote. And so over 700 of us are reading books, a new book each month about death and dying. And it's pretty exciting, the energy behind it, and knowing that there are this many people around the world who have kind of gotten engaged and excited about reading together and studying death and dying. And so if you're interested in being part of A Year of Reading Dangerously, you can go to the EOLU University website, eoluniversity.com. The homepage has a link, but you can also go directly to the page, to the sign-up page for the group at eoluniversity.com/year of reading. And I'll put the link for that page in the show notes for this episode, number 128, at eolupodcast.com. Yeah, be sure to sign up if you're interested, if you like to read and you want to read some books with 700 other people around the world and engage in discussions. And in many cases, the authors will be joining us for those discussions. So we'll be able to have some fantastic Q&A discussions, and I'm really looking forward to that. I'd also like to remind you that this podcast is sponsored by generous donations made through my page at patreon.com/EOLU, and Patreon is spelled Patreon. These contributions help defray some of the expenses of creating, producing, and broadcasting this podcast and also the End of Life University interview series. In addition, when you make a pledge of even $1 per month, that lets me know that you enjoy and benefit from this work I'm doing, and that emotional and spiritual support helps keep me going week after week. And literally, this podcast and the End of Life University interview series are still on the air this year in 2018 because of the support that I received last year, which really inspired me to want to keep going. And to continue to offer this material. And so I'm hugely grateful to all of my supporters who stepped up in 2017 to make contributions at patreon.com/EOLU. And if you're interested, you can go to that page as well if you'd like to sign up. You'll get some bonuses and benefits for being a patron, you'll get an extra Q&A recording where I answer your questions about death and dying, and I call that the Hospice Happy Hour. You'll get that recording once a month. You'll get access to like the Death Expo 2017 replays, and at the platinum level of support, you'll get unlimited access to the replays of every interview in 2018 on the End of Life University interview series. So again, you can go to patreon.com/EOLU if you're interested in becoming a supporter. So now I'm going to move on to my topic, why death education is important right now for everyone. And I'm emphasizing for everyone because I really think that we need an approach. We need to start thinking about reaching out with education at many different levels for different age groups, people in different work situations, to different job descriptions, different religions and cultures. We need to be reaching out with death education to our entire society. And in last week's podcast, when I talked a little bit about the consequences of ignoring death and in many ways the personal and individual consequences when we don't value and respect death as a teacher in our own lives. And this ignoring death has societal consequences as well. And death education is one of the ways that we can overcome the detrimental effects of our previous century of becoming disengaged with death and becoming in denial of death, avoiding it, shoving it aside, and not giving death the respect and the attention that it deserves in our society in general. And so when I say death education for everyone, I am literally talking about that. I think we need death education in the home for our children. I think parents should be responsible for it, but we need to educate parents how to teach their children about death and when to teach their children about death. And I'm going to do an episode in the future about that, so I'll be talking more about that subject. But I think ideally death education would start with younger children at home. And I can just share with you briefly, when my two children were 4 and 6, their 5-year-old cousin died of a congenital illness. And so we had really frank discussions at that very young age about death and dying. Plus, my kids had already had goldfish as pets that had died, and we had held funerals for their goldfish. And so in our family, we made a concerted effort to talk about death very openly and honestly, and when it occurred in our lives, and we didn't hide it from our kids. We talked about it. And so I think death education ideally begins in the home with parents learning how to teach their own children about death when it arises naturally within the life of their family together. So again, stay tuned because there will be a future podcast episode about that. I think that we need death education in our schools, and I think high school is a good age to begin some death education, perhaps as an elective course. And if you're a subscriber to the End of Life University interview series, if you tune in February, let's see, it will be I think February 25th is the date. You'll be able to hear, well, that might be wrong, February 22nd, I think it is. You'll hear an interview I did with a teacher and 3 students from a high school elective course that took place last year in December, called Death and the Meaning of Life. And it's fascinating. You'll love it. You'll love hearing the students talk about their experience learning about death, and the teacher talking about how he created the course and what it consisted of. And so I'm a huge proponent of this type of course being made available to students. I think high school is a great age to start learning more factual information about death and dying, and to even start their own exploration and to start thinking for themselves about death and dying. And in my own personal case, I started learning about death when I was 16, when one of my classmates died suddenly. And I was confronted with the reality that people of any age can die. And so I think that high school is a good age for death education to begin. And again, that's going to come up in that interview, and I'll also mention more about that in the podcast. Also, college is a perfect time. College students who have left home and they're exploring the world for the first time, they're just ripe for information. I think it's a great time for courses to be offered through psychology departments, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, culture, religion. Any of those departments, I think, could be offering classes in death and dying and exposing students to a perspective about death and dying. And next week, on next week's podcast, I'm going to be sharing an interview with Stacy Smith, who teaches a class called The Psychology of Death and Dying at my local community college. And I'm one of the guest lecturers for her class. And so I'll be featuring an interview with her where she talks about the benefits of this class, even her tips for teaching a class, and who should teach such a class at the college level. So I'll be going into that a little bit more in the future. Beyond there, I think that we need death education in churches. I think clergy members of every church and religion could use some additional education about death, and it's fine that they take the perspective of their religion on issues surrounding death, but I think we need to make sure clergy members know how to support their own congregants when they face death and when they're trying to make decisions. And so I would love to see clergy in every religion and every church be better able to educate and support their own congregants on these issues. And I'm not saying that I think that kind of education would change their belief system. I think it needs to be education within their belief system. But I do think church is a great place to consider death and dying, to talk about it, to create advanced directives together, and to talk about what really matters in life and grapple with what would we want at the end of life. So I'd love to see clergy members within churches being educated about how to teach others about end-of-life issues. I think we need death education in workplaces all around the country. There are statistics that say the average amount of paid bereavement leave in workplaces here in the U.S. is 4 days. And which in my mind, in many cases, is not at all adequate for allowing a person time and space for dealing with grief. So we're asking people to come back to work when they're still really torn apart and devastated by a death that has happened in their lives. And I'm quite sure that the average CEO or employer or even human resources person has no idea how to help a bereaved person within their workplace. So I think we need death education in the workplace all around our country. So to help the administrators better create policies and know how to handle bereavement and how to handle death and deal with it when it affects their employees, and also to teach employees how to connect with coworkers who have experienced death and dying. So that's another place that I think is just ripe for this kind of education and teaching. And it's obvious, and I talk about this a lot, and a lot of people talk about it, that we need better death education in the medical system itself. And so that would be medical school residency for physicians, nursing school, which probably already does a better job of of dealing with death and dying in nursing training, but I'm sure we could always use more. Even physician's assistants and nurse practitioners, anyone who deals with end-of-life issues with patients could use improved education about death and dying. For one thing, how to handle it professionally when working with patients, but also how to handle death in their own lives when it affects them personally, how to handle their own grief, both personal but also professional, managing grief when a patient has died and the guilt that ensues when a patient dies that we think should not have died or that we tried to prevent from dying. And so I think we have a desperate need for education in all aspects of the medical system, and that includes hospitals, for hospital staff, doing a much better job of training staff how to handle a dying patient, how to deal with family members of the dying, how to honor and respect the dying process and make it sacred within our hospital system, also in nursing homes and other facilities where patients reside as they are approaching the end of life. And so those are just, to begin with. I mean, if we sat down and really brainstormed about it, we could list other places. I'm sure our law enforcement officers and could use more death education, social services workers, our public health system, people within that system, even then in government, law. You could name any aspect of our society, and death education could be helpful for anyone in any one of those places. And one reason I want to emphasize this is my ultimate goal here is to encourage those of you listening to think about how you could become a death educator yourself in your world, in your community where you live, in the place where you work, in the profession or the career that you pursue, in your group of friends. I want you to really get creative and think about how could you take some of the information that you've been learning by listening to End of Life University about death and dying. How could you share that information in a way that helps others get educated? So this is my ultimate goal, is to inspire you listeners out there to become teachers. And I will say, you never stop becoming a student of death and dying. All of us are still students. We're learning something every day as we go along through life, and as we confront death in its many different forms in life. We're always learning, always students, always taking it in. I'm constantly learning from every single interview I do. Every time I do research for one of these solo podcasts that I do, I'm amazed at how much I learn. And so we are all always students, but I would love for all of us to adopt the mindset that we are also always teachers. And there will always be situations that we are in when we have the opportunity to share what we're learning with others. And so I would love it if you would come away from this whole series I'm going to be doing about death education, viewing yourself now as a teacher and feeling empowered to go forward wherever you are in your life and share with other people some of the knowledge that you are acquiring. And so for the rest of this talk, I want to go into a little bit about why death education is so important right now. And one of the things I mentioned in last week's podcast is that it's been a little over a century here in the U.S. that we have really been avoidant of and in denial of death. So for more than 100 years, death has been removed from our day-to-day awareness, and we've had the luxury actually of not even facing up to the uncomfortable topic of death and dying. We've had that luxury of pushing it out of our awareness, although death has its way of pushing itself back into our lives whenever it chooses. And the problem with it is the more that we've been in denial and the more that we haven't thought about death or prepared ourselves for death, the more shocked and devastated we are when death happens. And the more it takes us by surprise and pulls the rug out from underneath us. And I remember hearing a woman who was herself in her 70s, whose mother had just died at the age of 95. And she said to me, I was completely blindsided by my mother's death. And I said, your mother was 95? And she said, yes. I was in no way, I had never thought about the fact that my mother would die one day. I was in no way prepared for that. And that to me exemplified where we are in many ways as a society, that we have spent so little time, I mean, many of us have spent so little time thinking about the reality of death, that it hasn't even occurred to us that our grandparents or our elderly parents will die one day, that they are aging and that they are moving closer and closer to the end of life as each year passes. And so to think that a woman in her 70s had never thought about the fact that her mother would die one day, she obviously hasn't thought about the fact that she herself will die one day. So I'm telling you that little story because it epitomizes, I think, the extreme of the problems that start to arise when our ignorance of death and our denial of death has gone on throughout a lifetime. And of course, for all of us, it depends on our experiences with death. Some of us have experiences early in life, at a young age, of the deaths of people very close to us. And we are forced to confront death at a young age. Sometimes that can have a negative consequence. Some of us go into denial after experiencing a death at an early age that we couldn't cope with and didn't know how to manage and had no support for learning through and growing through the experience. So we may have completely shut ourselves down to the topic of death and dying. But some people, it's definitely true. I find this all the time when I'm interviewing people who work in the end-of-life arena. The number of people who got inspired to start working with death and dying because they had an experience at an earlier time in life with death themselves. And that experience really inspired and motivated them to want to become more active around death and dying, to think about it more for themselves and to want to work in that area. But those people are by far in the minority in our society who have been inspired to work with dying as a subject matter for their lives and as a focus of their career. So one of the reasons why I think it's essential right now for our society that we need to start today with increased education about death is because we are living much longer than we used to even 10 years ago. As our life expectancy has increased, the incidence of Alzheimer's and other dementias is also increasing because we're living long enough to be able to develop additional problems related to our aging and aging of the brain, and we are more likely to develop other diseases and cancers, like cancers and heart diseases and dementia that become the cause of death later on in life. The dementias in particular are very expensive illnesses, expensive to care for and treat at the end of life. And so it's really important that we at a younger age have planned ahead for ourselves and thought about what we want, but also thought about how will we live, how will we be cared for if we become debilitated at the end of our lives. Who will look after us, and where will that take place? How can we afford the care that might be necessary for us? And I think it's really essential that we take responsibility for our own end of life and think ahead in advance. How could we be prepared for it financially, emotionally, spiritually, within our families? How do we make enough plans for ourselves, at least, that we're not left completely wiped out financially at the end of life and unable to attain the care that we need at that time in life? And we live at a time when our technological advances are increasing like dramatically and rapidly. So our ability to forestall death and our ability to keep the human body alive has increased dramatically over the last few decades, but it has far outstripped our willingness to plan for the end of life. And so as medical technology continues to expand, we're going to find ourselves in more and more and more dilemmas, ethical and moral dilemmas about how much care should people receive? How much costly care should people receive? How much should we be trying to keep people alive if there's no longer quality of life or no longer consciousness? How far should we go? And because we've spent 100 years not thinking about death, kind of being oblivious to it, we really have not grappled very deeply with these issues. And we have to now. We have to consider these issues for ourselves. We have to really think through, what do I want? What do I want the outcome to be if I'm no longer able to speak for myself? Do I want to be kept alive or not? And that's a tough choice to make, and it's tough to sit here now as a healthy younger person and say what I might want if I'm 85 and in that situation. But it's so important that we at least begin the thought process and begin recording some of our wishes and thinking through what we might want. We may evolve those wishes continually over the next 20 years, but it's important that we start right now thinking this through so that we can be prepared when we're confronted with some of the difficult decision making, or when our loved ones are confronted with decisions they have to make on our behalf. And so this is one of the reasons we need death education for the public in our communities to help people begin to process some of the choices that they will have to make for themselves or for their loved ones in the future, so that they become aware of what issues might be there on the table, and that they have begun to formulate their own ideas of what fits for me, what is right for me, and what would I prefer at the end of life. So, we know that right now in our society, according to the Pew Research study that was done a few years ago, they found that when they asked people if they had thought about the end of life, about 37% of the people in their survey said a great deal. And about 35% said they had thought some about the end of life. So it had occurred to them. They'd done a little thinking. And about 27% of people had not thought about it at all. And these statistics correlate somewhat. We know that about a third of all adults here in the U.S. have put their end-of-life wishes in writing with some form of an advance directive. And this is, again, based on surveys that have been done. So about a third. And so the Pew study showed a little over a third of all people have thought about death and dying a great deal. And their study also showed, as could be expected, that there's a correlation. Those who have thought about death and dying have completed advance directives and put their wishes into writing. And so what we know is thinking about death, becoming informed about death, correlates with a willingness to create advance directives, to put wishes in writing, and to talk to family members. Those who had not thought at all about death and dying, as to be expected, did not have advance directives, had not had conversations about it. And so what we're hoping to do is to move the needle a little bit and to move some of the people from, maybe some of the people from that middle category who've thought a little bit about death and dying but haven't done their advanced planning, to help them think a little more and learn a little bit more about death and dying so that they're more likely to complete advanced directives. And perhaps some of those people who've never thought about death and dying as a ripple effect will be exposed to more conversations about death. We'll have death becoming more apparent in their day-to-day lives, and it will help jog them just a little bit so that they become more willing to think and talk about death and dying. And so what we're really talking about here, increasing death education and awareness, is we're really talking about starting a small movement that has a ripple effect over time, and that each person that you educate about death and dying is now a source of information for other people in that person's life, for family members and friends and coworkers and other people who may be struggling or need information. Each one person that you educate becomes an educator themselves and has the ability to go out and talk with others and share what they've learned and what they know. So this is why, if each one of us views ourselves as that educator, we can take seriously our ability to start to make changes in our community and then in our society as a whole by our willingness to share our knowledge and our information. But you might be wondering, so what difference does it make if people have advanced directives? Because so far, that's the one issue that I've directed. Those who think or learn about death and dying are more likely to complete advanced directives. And right now, statistically, it seems like about a third of our society has done that, has an advanced directive and put their wishes in writing. But you may have heard of the community of La Crosse, Wisconsin, which has been working for a few decades on this idea of getting people to put their end-of-life wishes in writing. And that community now has, according to what the article that I just read, 96% of the adults in La Crosse have completed an advanced directive. Phenomenal. It's amazing. And it was a concerted effort through some healthcare facilities and a nursing home facility that they decided to start educating people and asking them about advanced directives and encouraging them to complete them and helping them complete advanced directives. So what difference did that make in La Crosse? And one of the differences that we saw, that they have seen in La Crosse, is that the cost of end-of-life care per individual in La Crosse decreased by about 30% per patient. So the expenditures at the end of life did decrease over time with this increased number of advanced directives. It makes sense if people are completing an advanced directive and instructing their family members and loved ones and physicians that they don't want heroic measures or extreme measures at the end of life. It makes sense that they're likely to receive less costly care that's more appropriate to their illness and their prognosis, and that there could be some cost savings. And again, none of us wants to overemphasize money, because end-of-life decisions should not be based on money, really, because there's so many things that matter so much more than just money. But in our society, one of the issues we are facing is Medicare shortages in the future, and the fact that Medicare, about 25 to 30% of the Medicare budget goes for care at the end of life for Medicare recipients. And so I would say not so much the idea of saving money, but how to use the resources we have in the most effective and efficient way possible. So how do we utilize those resources for things that truly make a difference and that truly improve quality of life for individuals and their families, rather than allotting that money for care that might even be unwanted by the patient, except the patient has never expressed their wishes, so no one knows that. Allotting that money for costly, futile care that patients may not want. Preserving those dollars instead of, I will say, wasting the dollars on care that isn't wanted, making it available to maybe cover more palliative care or maybe more in-home services that help patients more with quality of life, maybe paying for caregiver services that could improve quality of life for patients and families. So it's not just about spending less money or wanting to save money. It is about how do we utilize the resources we have in the best way possible for the most positive outcome, for the well-being of the most people. So to continue on, as we think about these issues about how can education make a difference, I was really fascinated to read a study about attitudes here in the U.S. toward the cost and effectiveness of end-of-life treatment, and that 54% of people in a survey believe that end-of-life treatments, no matter what they are worth it, and that they lead to longer and better quality lives. And so these people believe in our technology and believe in healthcare and its ability to extend the quality and the length of life, about 54%. And at the same time, about 41% in that same survey think that treatment at the end of life may cause as many problems as it solves. And so these people are more likely to be skeptical. They're much more likely to have an advance directive that says, I don't want care at the end of life. Now, what I think that shows us is that there may be room for education, for factual, realistic education about healthcare at the very end of life, about the use of technology and the use of extreme measures at the end of life, and the likelihood that they will be beneficial or helpful. And we do know from studies of patients receiving chemotherapy for stage 4 cancers that family members of those patients and the patients themselves are far more likely to be unrealistic about the potential for a cure or improvement from the treatments they're receiving. They have unrealistic expectations that have not been addressed because they haven't been educated about the reality of the severity of illness and what the statistics mean. You know, if the statistics show that this treatment is 5% effective, they haven't been given a realistic expectation of what that means. So we know that people are choosing treatment because they believe in it, because they want to believe in the potential of our healthcare system. And I'm not saying that there isn't the potential there, that there aren't miracles and that there aren't cures that take place, because they certainly do, but that we could use education to help people have a realistic understanding of what is possible, so that when they're making choices for themselves, they can really decide the odds are vastly against this treatment making any difference, and there's a much greater likelihood that the treatment is going to make me feel sick. So do I want that? Do I want those tiny odds that it could help me get better? Or am I willing to say, I don't know, I don't think that's what I need right now? And I'm not saying judgmentally that one choice or the other is better than another, but I'm saying people need the education. They need factual information, honest conversations about what to expect at the end of life so that when they are making choices, they're dealing with facts and not just with their hopefulness or their uninformed beliefs about the potential of extreme measures in medicine to make a difference. So I think there's a huge space for education there to help people have more realistic attitudes about the effectiveness of treatment at the end of life. And we also know when we look at doctors, one of the things that has fascinated me is that when doctors are surveyed, 88% of doctors, when they talk about their own end-of-life wishes, say that they would not want CPR or to be coded at the end of life. They have strong feelings about that. And yet, the vast majority of doctors do not discuss those issues with their patients. And in spite of the fact that in 2016, Medicare began paying for end-of-life conversations, 1 year later, after that payment became available, a study showed that only 14% of doctors had utilized that billing code and charged for the end-of-life conversations that were now available. And those who had not used it were surveyed on why. And the majority of them said, because I've never been trained to have the conversation. So doctors will openly say they're adamant they do not want extreme measures for themselves at the end of life. And yet, at the same time, they're not talking to patients about the choices at the end of life because they've never been trained to have a conversation with a patient about something they feel strongly about in their own lives. So I think this shows the desperate need for education for doctors. How do you talk to patients? How do you bring up these issues? How do you educate the patient about their options and choices at the end of life? And how do you even guide them and help them make the best decisions for them? So while doctors are clear about their own personal wishes for their own health care, they are not clear about how to guide a patient, how to help a patient make decisions for themselves, particularly how to bring up the conversation and even talk about it. So we have a huge knowledge and education gap there for healthcare providers who need that education in order to have these conversations with patients. Now, the majority of us, and probably those of you listening to this conversation, may not be in a position to educate doctors about how to have conversations. So I'm not saying, oh my gosh, you have to go out and figure out how can you teach your doctor how to have a conversation about the end of life, only that you're aware of the importance of this issue so that you could discuss it with others, and you might even be the one who brings up with your own doctor, hey, how come you've never asked me if I have an advance directive? Don't you think that's important to talk about? Maybe, could we talk about that on my next appointment? Because I have some questions and I'd like to review them with you. So maybe that's how you would end up educating your own doctor or encouraging your doctor to start thinking about these issues. One of the other reasons I think it's really important right now that we start encouraging death education is because, again, we have increasing technologies that we have to struggle with to decide, are we or are we not going to utilize them at the end of life. But we have other dilemmas facing our society, ethical and moral dilemmas, that have the potential to split our families apart. And I'm talking about physician-assisted dying. Right now, our society is pretty well divided. 47% favor laws that support physician-assisted dying, and this is according to just the Pew Research study that I read. 49% are opposed, but it's close to 50-50. And easily this issue over physician-assisted dying could split a family in half as well. And so death education is really important, and I'm not saying death education with an agenda that pushes people in one direction or another, only that gives people information and facts to help them figure out where they stand and how they feel, and even to help them discuss intelligently the issues at hand. Also, from the Pew Research study, some more interesting statistics along this line. 66% of people said they feel that sometimes doctors should allow a patient to die, that sometimes doctors should make the choice that we've done enough, we can't do anything more, and should step back and allow natural death to occur. 66%, that's a fairly high percentage, and yet 31% in that same study said they felt doctors should always do everything possible to help a patient live, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the patient's physical condition is, no matter the prognosis, no matter the cost of the treatment. 31% felt doctors should always do everything possible. So this is like a 2/3, 1/3 split in our society of about 1/3 of the people believing that there's a moral obligation for doctors to do everything for a patient. And so if you apply that kind of percentage to our families, when you bring a family together, there's likely to be a few people within the family who have that belief system as well. Everything should be done to keep a person alive. And other members might say, no, let's let it go, let's stop. So this is why it's important for the patient to have done a lot of soul searching about these questions and to know, this is what I prefer, this is what I want, because those families could be guided by their loved ones' wishes and their loved ones' preferences instead of reacting from their own biases. If they understand the person I love wants it to be this way, it may help those families avoid some of the costly conflicts that could happen at the end of life. So again, these dilemmas, as I said, splitting our society apart, physician-assisted dying, when to offer care and when not to. It's important. These are going to become more and more prevalent in our families and in society in general as our society ages. So education can only help us to further examine the issues, to further examine our different perspectives, and to try to find common ground and ways that we can come together. And again, education that helps us put our own wishes in writing is extremely important for overcoming some of these conflicts that might take place in a family. Another reason why death education is really important right now, we know that lack of preparation is costly. And number one, we've already talked about in terms of treatment, patients are more likely to receive treatment they didn't even want, treatment that might be futile for their illness, if they haven't prepared, if they haven't talked to anyone, decided what they'd like for themselves, and put those wishes into writing. So medical treatment alone, costly at the end of life if no steps have been taken to put in place a possible less costly alternative. And funeral expenses as well tend to be higher when patients and their families have not talked about death or not made plans, because those family members, if they have no idea what their loved one might want at the end of life, may be more vulnerable to purchasing the premium funeral plan and paying for more expensive service and more expensive arrangements than their loved one would have wanted. And they may not be in a place emotionally where they can seek out lower cost options, options even that are more environmentally friendly and less costly to the planet in general. So planning ahead reduces the financial cost of treatment, of funeral planning at the end of life. And then, as I've already mentioned as well, it reduces the toll on families. So educated people are more likely to plan ahead about the end of life, and their families are more likely to have less conflicts because of the planning that's been done, and that reduces a toll and stress on the family. It also reduces some of the burden of grief, because when you have known and understood what your loved one wanted and you've been able to help follow through on those wishes and carry them out, that can be a very satisfying and even healing experience as you look at, we did the best we could for mom. She had the funeral she wanted. She got the care that she wanted in the way that she wanted it. When you know what a loved one wants and you're able to help create that for them, that's a very positive feeling, even though you're dealing with the pain of loss. And so being better prepared because we're better educated can help us reduce some of the emotional and spiritual toll on our families. And then the fifth way that death education can help us, this reflects back to last week's podcast about the consequences of ignoring death. It's just there's an emotional and spiritual cost of failing to learn to value life by appreciating death. And I talked a lot about that last week. If we go through our lives oblivious to death and not acknowledging that death will come and not being prepared and aware of death and not having done as much work as we possibly can to be in a place of readiness for death, the cost for us when our loved ones die is higher because we are blindsided. The rug is pulled out from us. We weren't ready. We're not prepared. We don't know what to expect. The cost to us as we face our own mortality when aging begins to happen and we find ourselves losing some of our physical faculties is greater. We're more devastated. We're less able to cope. We're more likely to get depressed or to become suicidal because we don't know how to manage what's happening in our very own lives. So being prepared for death, being educated about it, being aware, having planned ahead, helps us spiritually and emotionally to live life better, to enjoy every moment, to realize, whoa, this isn't going to last that long. Who knows? I could die at any time. I'm going to make the most of this life I have, so that we actually live more fully and enjoy life more while we have it. And then we're a little bit less shocked and blindsided when death does arrive. And when we get a diagnosis that says, well, now you have something that you are not going to recover from, you're in a better spot with which to deal with that type of diagnosis and to still live quality through the end of all of your days and to make choices that enhance the quality of your life. So to sum it up, some of the reasons why I feel we need death education: one, because we're living longer and we're more likely to die of chronic diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's and other dementias, which can be expensive and which require some decision making from us to decide how much treatment or care we would want at the end of life. And two, because our technological advances are continuing, are ongoing, and our ability to forestall death has outstripped our ability and willingness to plan ahead for death and to make choices for our end of life. So we've got to catch up to the technology. We've got to do some remedial studying here in order to prepare ourselves for the choices that we're going to have to make in the future. A third reason why it's really important that we have death education right now is because of these ethical and moral dilemmas facing our society that split us apart in society and also in our families, dealing with physician-assisted dying, and even dealing just with how much medical care to receive at the end of life, and when is it okay to stop medical treatment and allow natural death to occur. So being educated about those choices, planning ahead, and informing our loved ones about our wishes are one of the ways we can do a better job of dealing with those ethical and moral dilemmas. And then also the cost of being unprepared for death. There's the financial cost of receiving too much medical treatment, of paying for funerals that are over the top and not even wanted, and then the emotional toll on our families from being unprepared. And then fifthly, the emotional and spiritual cost of not allowing death to be a teacher for our lives, and of not learning how to live life fully and enjoy every moment of life because we prepared for it by learning about death. So I'll remind you once again to keep tuning in to future episodes. As I said, next week I'll feature an interview with Stacy Smith, who teaches a college-level course, The Psychology of Death and Dying, and you'll love hearing about that, and that should inspire you a lot. I'm going to have an interview on End of Life University about a high school elective class in Death and Dying. Death and the Meaning of Life was the title of that course. And let's see, there will be upcoming episodes on this podcast. I'm going to talk about talking to children, how we can teach our children about death in our own homes. I'll also be doing a podcast on grief and how we can educate others about grief. So those are just a few things coming up in the future. So stay tuned. Tune in every Monday for a new episode of this podcast and for more of this interesting information. And then I also want to let you know that I have something available for you that you can download, and it is teaching guidelines for a death and dying class. And so I've created an ebook for you that has a lot of guidelines about how to put together a class. So this is mostly focused on putting together a community-based class, like a class that you might hold at a senior center or a church on death and dying, how to do some of the logistics and the nuts and bolts of putting together a class. So teaching guidelines for a death and dying class. And you can, there will be a link on the show notes for this episode at EOLUpodcast.com where you can download the teaching guidelines, and you can also go to EOLUniversity.com/guidelines, and you'll find a place to download the guidelines there. So I want to offer that to you as a free gift. And go ahead and get a hold of it. If you're interested at all in teaching a class, if you even have the slightest inkling, you might want to get it so that you could read it. It's free. Just read through some of my thoughts about how and why to teach a class, and see if you feel inspired, because maybe it'll give you some ideas for how to teach a class. And then it's a little bit early yet for me to give you any details, but in March I'm planning to do a work group for people who want to start a class, who want to start teaching a class. So get the ebook now, start thinking about it, and by March, sometime in later March, you'll be hearing the details about this work group I'm going to put together, where we'll spend maybe 4 days an hour a day meeting together and brainstorming your class and creating the class and the syllabus and kind of giving you encouragement, but also any other details that you might need to help you put that class together. Okay, so that's all coming up in future episodes. So go to eoluniversity.com/guidelines in order to download that ebook. And you can also get a link to that if you just go to the show notes at eolupodcast.com and look for episode number 128. So this has been really fun. Thanks for listening to me talk about death education. As I mentioned before, I'm passionate about it this year in 2018, so you're going to hear about it from me over and over again. So hang on for the ride. I hope you get excited about it too. One thing, if you enjoy this podcast and the type of content I put out, if you are willing to, please go to iTunes and leave a review for the podcast, because the more positive reviews I get for this podcast, the more it will be offered to people who are searching for this kind of information. So I encourage you to leave just a brief review, and that will really help me out a lot. You can go to eolupodcast.com and you'll find a link there for how to leave a review on iTunes as well. So until next week, have a wonderful week. Take care, and remember to face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings your way, and love your life. Don't forget to love your life, no matter what it is. Love that you're here. Love that you woke up this morning and you get one more day to see the sunrise and to just experience life here on this beautiful planet. So until the next time we're together, I just want to say goodbye, and looking forward to talking to you again.